And hello again, and here we are back in my garage on another wet, windy day. So hopefully you can hear me okay above the noise of the wind outside. Last week or so I've not had much time in the garage, so I can't really show you much progress on the Guzzi or indeed 1170 here. But I have been thinking about this engine here, which is an old Kawasaki Z1000A1 engine, cases anyway, and also of course I've got a block here now, put it on temporarily. Both the cases and the block need an awful lot of work. I've got no internals at all, and the block will need reboring and new pistons and everything. I don't even have a head, have nothing really, I got nothing at all, so you know, in some ways it's bad, but also in some ways it's good because it means I can do whatever I want. I can build a big bore engine, I can build it quite standard, I can go mad with it, who knows. And also at the moment I've got no frame for it, I've got no chassis, no logbook or anything, so again, that could be a bad thing, so I've got to go and buy one or source one, but it also means I can have a big wide choice of what I do with this engine. Now, this project won't be anytime soon, it's going to be probably 2023, a year or so's time, when all these other projects I've got here are finished and done with, I can concentrate on one project at a time. But I was thinking about what to do with this engine, and as it turns out, last week, Jeff finished building the crank that will go in this engine one day in the future. Because I bought this crank from D&K online, and when it turned up, it turned out I'd either ordered the wrong one or they'd sent me the wrong one. It was a Z1000A1, I think an early Z1000 crank, and I needed a later crank for a Mark II, because that's the one that was going to go in here. Now, as it turns out, the crank was actually quite a good crank. I mean, I've got some good stuff from the D&K in the past, and you sometimes wonder, well, are there second-hand parts of engines worn out and just scrap? But normally they're not, they're actually okay. So Jeff has taken it all apart, checked it out, cleaned out all the sludge traps and rebuilt it, good as new, so it can go in this engine at some point in the future. And in fact, if I move now, just a second, behind me, I'd be careful because I don't want to take it out of its sealed bag here, but it's quite heavy. So this is the crank. I won't take it out of the bag because I don't want to get dirty and any specks of dust or grit on it, so that can stay in this bag for the time being. I'll go and find a home for it in the house where it's warm and dry, and one day we'll come back and use that in this engine. Yeah, so as I say, I've been thinking about what to do with this engine, and I've had a sort of mad idea, a sort of silly idea really, which may not happen or it may do, who knows, but it'll certainly be quite an interesting project if I go ahead with it. So let me go and get my chair out because my knees are killing me right now, and I'll explain. Okay, so now I'm sitting comfortably. I want to show you two things that I've got on my lap here. And the first one is this. This is Superbike Magazine from July 1979. I better cover up the topless model on the front cover. And this magazine and the front cover is linked to this rather, well, pretty boring looking Kawasaki cylinder block. And you think, oh, why is that then? Well, because, let me find this again, on the front cover here we've got two drag bikes from the late 70s. These were two drag bikes with their owners who were sort of at the top of the pile, as it were, in the UK at that time for drag racing. One is a twin-engined supercharged or double supercharged Norton, and at the back there is a twin-engine Kawasaki that's not supercharged. One at the back is called LA Hooker. It's quite a famous drag bike, and in fact there were several drag bikes built by the same owner with the same name. And the chappie at the back, who owns that bike, is a chap called Rod Pallant, and he actually was into Harleys of all things. He was also into big V8 cars, and he must have plenty of money back then because these things weren't cheap to build. And it was quite successful. So Rod Pallant, back in the late 70s, obviously decided that, well, you know, twin Kawasaki big bore engines wasn't enough. He went to what was becoming the standard configuration for nitro drag bikes of the day. In fact, it still is the standard configuration, which to say the engine is supercharged, nitro burning, with the exhaust pipes at the back and the supercharger at the front. The only problem with that is, if you try to fit a supercharger to the front of a standard Kawasaki Z or a big bore one, you hit a problem, and I'll try and explain what the problem is. So if we put this to one side for a second, here we have the cylinder block on this engine, the standard one here, and the problem is that if you fit a standard head this block, you can in fact spin it round because the holes are all symmetrical. But where you get a problem is at this little part of the block here, and that's because that's where the cam chain adjuster goes. So if you turn the block around, or indeed turn the head round on the block, then you've got a gap here. It doesn't work. You know, you can't get around it. You cannot fit a head and reverse it on a standard block like this. It's just not possible. People do try, of course, and they do all kinds of clever things to try and make it happen, but no, it's not really a sensible thing to do, particularly when you're trying to get 500 plus brake horsepower from an engine. So Mr. Rod Pallant, back in the day, back in the 70s, decided, I'll solve this problem once and for all. And he had somebody make him, we don't know exactly how many, 5 or 6 special blocks. He cast them in the UK with the problem solved, because these have an additional bit of meat on both sides of the block, so you can reverse the head and everything will still work. You don't have a problem. I mean, you do have a problem because you've got to alter the cam chain adjusters and that sort of thing, but overall this solves that problem. Now you might think, well, that's all very well, but why have you got it? And I've got it because I borrowed it from Jeff. He's had it on his shelf for God knows how long, 20 odd years, and as you can see here, there's no liners in it, there's nothing, it's just a sort of cast and basically machine block, but it will fit on a standard Kawasaki Z. So my idea would be to use this and build a reverse head Kawasaki with a supercharger at the front. I know Les is watching this saying, oh, that's what I want to build, and I know he said to me not long ago during one of our little chats that when he was building his supercharged Z Mark II, he has a supercharger at the back and the downpipes at the front, as you might expect, but his intention all along was back in the day to have that as a sort of intermediate step, and his final evolution of that bike was to have the headers at the back, exhaust pipes going back behind the seat, and the supercharger being at the front. And that all sounds okay, fine. I could build that, or I can get Jeff to build it for me, you know, no great problem. And in fact, somewhere I've got yeah, just a second, over here I've got a liner that Jeff has got from somewhere. It actually needs taking out to, it says here, 80mm, which will give you a 1327 block. So this cylinder block needs machining out to take these. In fact, it's a bit of a fit. It will actually slide in, but it still needs a bit more work. It also needs to have the top machined to take the slip, because it sits, you know, flush with the top of the head, and then it all needs to be machined out, because these are about 79.5, I think he told me. So once they're in the block, they need to be machined properly and everything flattened and get ready to go. So then in terms of a supercharger at the front, well, we've got this here. Just grab it over here. This is one of the 4 or 5 supercharger cases that Jeff made some time ago. It is actually on the channel somewhere on one of the Jeff's shed builds. Not sure which one. I'll put a link up in the description below where we see him making this thing. In fact, he made 4. And this is meant to take the standard internals of an Eaton 45 supercharger, which I think are currently or were used on a Mini Cooper, which are like 1.6 litres, make about 200 brake horsepower. So in theory, you know, it should work quite well on a Kawasaki, which makes, you know, 100, 150 maybe, something like that. So yeah, so we just got to find the internals for this thing and make it all work. Now, I've also got somewhere, if we can find it. Where's it gone? Okay, so I had to stop a while ago because there was some building work going on next door, so you couldn't hear me. But now at least I've got a cup of tea, and I was going to say that when it comes to this handmade Eaton supercharger case that Jeff made, he decided that these flat end pieces were a bit boring. He didn't like it, so what he did was he made 2 of these. Now this apparently is a trial run. He changed it a little bit on his final version that he made for his Honda drag bike supercharger. But what he's done is he has machined down this really thick plate and made it a bit more interesting. It's got these webs here, these 2 mounts in the middle for the bearings, and the idea I think was that is trying to make it look cast like an original old Supercharger from back in the day. I mean, personally, I actually quite like it just like that. I don't think you need to do much with it. I think he's going to polish and round off all these edges on his Honda drag bike Supercharger, but quite honestly I quite prefer this style. I think if you had all that fully polished or had it, I don't know, anodized black or something, it would look pretty damn cool. So yeah, that would go on the end of there to replace that thick plate. On the other side of the Supercharger, of course, you don't have this. You have a snout, a drive snout that comes out to somewhere that would then drive a Supercharger from the engine. And that's what we're going to talk about next, because so far all this sounds very easy, but believe me, it's not. And so if we consider how to fit a Supercharger like this on the front of an engine like this, straight away we can see we've got some problems, because first of all, the frame down tubes get in the way. There's not enough room between the engine and the downpipes to fit something as big as this, but perhaps you could fit a manifold. I do have a manifold that Jeff made some time ago that I forgot to bring over, but it's actually quite narrow. It can probably just fit between the engine and these down tubes, and it's got a hole here in the middle where you can fit the Supercharger. Now, these kind of Superchargers are normally fitted to drag bikes, of course, and drag bikes have a huge long top tube and lots of rake at the front, which means there's a big gap right here. On a road bike you don't get that, so if you try to fit something like this round about here, it's not going to work because there's no room. The wheel's going to hit it, of course, the tyre's going to hit the damn thing, so that's no good. So the obvious thing to do is to mount this Supercharger low down in front of the engine, way down here where there's more room. And that's where a lot of drag bikes mount their Superchargers, really low down here in front of the engine, often surrounded by some kind of air dam. And that's because obviously they want to keep the weight forward and low on a drag bike to prevent it from wheeling and so on, for weight distribution. In my case here, if I'm using a fairly standard frame with this sort of standardish front end, it's got to go here because that's the only place there's room enough to avoid hitting the front wheel. And the next problem is how do you drive the Supercharger, and in this case what we'd have to do is extend the crank on the right hand side, put a pulley on it which goes forward through a belt, and then it will drive the Supercharger low down at the front of the bike. That in turn causes all kinds of problems, not least of which is what do you do about the ignition system, because the ignition triggers are in that same spot. So again, it's not easy at all, there's lots of issues you've got to consider when trying to fit something like this. Yes, that's just a possible project looking ahead into the future. It certainly won't be easy, but then again, if it was easy I wouldn't want to do it because that's boring. However, that said, my history of building these one-off bikes means that, oh, God knows when they'll be finished. They just take an awful lot longer than I ever expect. I mean, the Gus has been going on for, well, off and on to be fair, for about 7 or 8 years. The 1170 here is about 2.5 years in, and by now I hope for it to be finished, but I'm still waiting for the bodywork to come back from the painter, and I've still got a few annoying little niggly problems to sort out. This Mark II behind me shouldn't be such a problem because it's, well, a lot of work's already been done, and the majority of the work is the engine, and I'm not doing that, so hopefully it should move a lot quicker than I'm used to. So God knows when a supercharged engine bike will be built, God knows when. Maybe 2023, maybe 10 years from now if we're all still here, but I wouldn't hold my breath. What I would finish with though is that I like building bikes like this, so I don't really care if it takes 5 years, because it's 5 years of enjoyment of going through the ideas, trying different things out, learning new things. So yeah, if it takes 5 years, it takes 5 years. I'm not too worried about that. I have other bikes to ride in the meantime, so it's not a big deal. Anyway, that's a little possible project for the future. My cup of tea is now empty, so it's time to stop. So thanks for watching and cheers.